Now, I want to speak about the unbounded self. More and more people are unhappy with their own personality. They want to leave it behind and reinvent themselves. Even when no pathogenic experiences or developments make them suffer emotionally, they feel limited and other-directed by their familiar or social development, and hence by a psychic structure that naturally accompanies this development. They want to be completely free and self-determined, and therefore strive to reinvent a personality that has more or less nothing to do with their previous one. This new pursuit for autonomy and freedom seems neither to be insane, nor does it show a fixation on oneself, nor does it rebel against something. It is rather a completely plausible reaction to digital technology and electronic media, through which the surrounding reality can not only be newly and differently developed, but also constructed and perceived in a new way. Why should this fascinating possibility to construct reality anew, in a new, different way, why should this possibility not apply to one's own personhood, one's own personality, and one's own psychic structuring? People's pursuit for freedom changed with the digital revolution such that everyone wants to decide on his or her own what actuality is. I have called this the corresponding character orientation, ego orientation, because everyone, without consideration for prescriptions and requirements from the environment, wants to determine on his or her own what reality is and with which reality he or she wants to deal. The right to this kind of self-determination is thereby acknowledged by everyone. Consequently, new forms of togetherness are created in the interpersonal space and in the social structure that measure up to this wish for self-determination. An empirical investigation from 2005 into the incidence of the ego orientation showed that back then as much as 20% of Germany's adult population was dominantly ego-oriented in their character structure. The specific pursuit of autonomy of ego-oriented people can be captured best from a psychological perspective as the pursuit for delimitation, or as a pursuit for delimitation or boundlessness. The words delimitation and unboundedness are used to translate the German Entgrenzung, which represents a very specific interaction with limits or boundaries. Entgrenzung always means that former limits are abolished. It is not about a violation of limits, or a contestation of limits, or a transgression of limits in which a limit is left behind, but about an elimination of limits through a new construction of reality. This means that in a newly constructed reality, these limits either really no longer exist or subjectively no longer exist because they are no longer observed or repudiated. I will first sketch out which developments promote the formation of the pursuit of Entgrenzung. A subsequent section then will be about the enactment and formation of reality and its application to the new construction of personality. Finally, it will be shown how this personality has an impact on the psychic structure and on therapeutic practice. The reasons for the significant increase in the pursuit of unboundedness can be found first in the current technical possibilities for delimitation. Secondly, they can be found in the demand for unboundedness of the economy, of business and society, that more and more people have to make their own if they don't want to fall into the professional or social void. The overwhelming achievements in the area of digital technology and electronic media, as well as networking, have begun a dynamic of delimitation that was until recently hard to imagine, and that has since changed numerous research and life domains. Think just of imaging procedures, or the decryption of the genetic code that would be impossible without computers and electronic media. To illustrate this a bit more with an example of the possibilities of delimitation, almost completely space and timeless data transfer brought and continues to bring us to a revolutionized acquisition of information and knowledge. Information, purchases, advice of all kinds, and the many other treasures of lost know-how can be found in a mobile phone, in an iPad or a tablet hybrid, without having to change location, be mindful of business hours, or have to consider waiting times. Given the fascinating possibilities of delimitation, it is not surprising that unboundedness becomes a key word to the solution of all economic, social research and human problems, and that technology that dissolves boundaries is regarded at the level of universal remedies. For example, delimitation allows for the flexibilization of the working world. Also here, it is already showing that not every dissolution of boundaries is beneficial in the person, for the person. If in many industrialized nations the professional world has characterized by long-term careers and lasting employment relationships, in stable enterprises and social security systems, this projective external grounding is increasingly breaking away. Here, delimitation does not mean only being able to enjoy more flexible working hours or part-time work or working from home office. Everything that gives protection and bearing, which provides grounding, is also unbounded. The threat of atypical employment relationships, such as temporary positions and the deficiencies of open-ended contracts, shift work, night, weekend, Sunday work, are widely gaining ground despite of overwhelming data on the negative health impacts and about the potential for familial and social conflict that accompany this dissolved limits. The most impactful dissolution of boundaries in the professional sphere is the establishment of the so-called self-employer. For him, work turns from something prescribed to something one must give, steer and control oneself. Instead of enjoying the provision, the care, the advance payments, and direction of an employer, the entrepreneurial activities are to be contributed by the worker himself. The consequences, an increase in self-exploitation of the employer. The employer has to identify himself with the requirements of delimitation in the economic arena so that he himself develops a wish to deal according to today's more unbounded professional activities. As the methods of delimitation are internalized, rationalization, economization, and controlling are no longer perceived as something foreign, but as something of innate. This subjectivization of work is reached through corporate achievement, primarily in that the work organization becomes more flexible and working relationships are destabilized. It suggests itself that such pressure to perform will lead to an excessive demand on oneself and finally to a burnout. Delimitation is, and here I come to the third reason for the formation of a desire for delimitation, not just a promotion in the organization of work, but also a recipe for success with respect to the question of what the economy really produces. Next to the production of goods and services, indeed, realities are also increasingly produced. Successful economic enterprises have transitioned in the last decade more and more to investing all energy in the production of environment and desired realities. Of course, goods and services also continue to be produced, but that which is offered and sold are realities. Realities in the form of emotional worlds, of states of arousal, of experiences, emotions, passions, environments, and lifestyles. Whoever wants to have commercial success today must bank on emotionalization and sell feelings and sell experiences. The production of sentimentality and events is particularly noticeable in the ever-growing cultural industry. The production of emotional reality is supposed to give certain target groups the possibility to feel alive, full of feeling, active, creative, dependent, stimulated, secure, or full of passion. The end point of such a development is a world in which practically every activity becomes a produced or an acquired experience. Life, and especially emotional life, with its feelings, wishes, likes and dislikes, becomes a commodity. Communication and culture industry produce it for us, and we buy it from them, and we buy from them life experiences and feelings in that we pay for admission to the world of experience offered to us. The mention of these reasons, the fascinating technical possibilities of delimitation, the more flexible professional world, and the current success model of the capitalist economy to sell reality should suffice to justify why more and more people are driven in their thinking, feeling, and acting by the dissolution of boundaries. Because delimitation is experienced both as fascinating and threatening psychologically. Two ways of internalization can be made out. One, an identification with the means to dissolve boundaries. The other, a reaction formation against the demands of boundary dissolution. In internalization by identification, one defines oneself in relation to one's own being by the ability of these technical wonders. I am and define my feelings of self-esteem by my access to the media that facilitate delimitation. Those identified to such an extent with the means of boundary dissolution identify themselves through an excitement for unbounded realities, also through an existential dependency. If their do-everything phone is stolen, or if their hard drive gives out, they then feel lost, worthless, totally powerless, because they no longer possess their means of unboundedness. That is, their access to and connectivity with the unbounded realities are called into dispute. A pursuit of boundlessness can also result from reaction formation, especially if one is confronted with a demand for boundlessness in a professional capacity, a demand to let go of everything valued, secured, orientating and grounding, and instead to reinvent oneself as a means of production, then delimitation becomes experienced as a threat and results in psychological strain. But both the resulting anger and sorrow cannot be acknowledged or acted out or acted upon, because they are perceived as weakness, as an inability to work under pressure, and as lacking motivation or lacking inspiration, as one says today, and will push one even more into a losing position. In this psychological unbearable situation, there are two psychological escapes. The one leads to a build-up of symptoms and psychic illness, to anxiety disorders, to depressive moods and depressions, complete with somatic equivalents such as backaches or heart complaints. With the expression burn out, the burnout syndrome, already discussed today, makes these symptoms more graphic. The suffering at the exploitative demands of unboundedness uproots several energy resources. Next to the formation of a symptom, which is the expression of an inadequate internalization of the pursuit of unboundedness, character formation also offers a way out. In this, those mentioned identify with that which threatens them. Such a reaction formation leads to an egosyntonic behavior. One does not feel anger towards the dissolution of boundaries, but is excited for it. One does not suffer anymore from the lack of boundaries, but seeks it out. As different as the mechanisms to internalize the pursuit of unboundedness may be, the result is always that one gladly and passionately promotes that which the current economic and society needs to function, and therefore also strives for boundlessness or unboundedness. On principle, there is nothing negative in it, because every person is always a social being and has to strive to conform for the success of society if he does not want to completely isolate himself socially. We will ask in another segment about the possibilities of unbounding one's own personality, knowing that it's not about crossing boundaries through developmental steps, through the process of learning, training, practicing, of parting and mourning, etc., that borders of human possibility let themselves be crossed. Instead, it is about means and ways that borders of one's own personhood can be eliminated. There have always been methods in which an unbounded personality could be constructed. Some of these are regression, which we use in therapy, the dissolution of boundaries through psychotropic substances or excessive behavior, or the enactment of reality. The enactment of reality of particular interest here existed before, for instance in closed societies or in psychiatric illnesses. But today, digitalization and electronic media allow for the construction of tailored virtual realities for all eventualities in which anyone can afford to immerse oneself. Because the problem of unboundedness through psychotropic substances and excessive behaviors is known to us from substance dependencies, there will be a short discussion of the enactment of reality and a more thorough discussion of virtualization through simulation. Now, delimitation through enactment is about a fleeting identification with a different personality. Enactment takes place in art, in literature, in rituals, but also in courtly society or today in popular fantasy. Except for a few exceptions, most people are capable of telling the image, the imagined, enacted reality, the unbounded reality, from the factual and the external reality. The only new thing is that thanks to technical innovation, everyone can enjoy such enactment of reality anytime, almost everywhere. There is no dependency on specific people, places, situations, institutions, or mediumistic abilities, just those of electronic media. Enacted realities have very different contents and want to establish access to reality and parallel worlds that are either contained in everyday experiences or bring a fantasy world into being. Even if they are completely fantastic and unreal, their character is enacted reality. Their character as enacted reality remains conserved and conscious to the consumer. Unlike enactment, the dissolution of boundaries through simulation typically aims at disabling the ability to distinguish between fantasy and reality, between wish and actuality, between illusion and reality. What is true in a good flight simulator, namely that the ability of controlling reality is obscured, is also a precondition for every plunge into a virtual world. The more perfect the simulation, the less significant is the control over reality, and also the confrontation with a burdensome reality. The virtualization of reality resulting from today's simulation techniques aims at an experience of reality that is no longer subject to any control. This is already evident from the definitions of the words virtual, virtuality, and virtual reality. By virtual reality, we understand something that does not exist in the same form in reality in which it appears to exist, but nevertheless shows all of the functionings and effects of such a reality. The opposite of virtual is therefore not real, but physical. The virtual does not exist in reality, but has, as far as possible, all signs and identifying markers of reality in a person's perception. Science fiction writer William Gibson, therefore, is right in saying that, I'm quoting, cyberspace presupposes a consensual hallucination. Going by everything we know today about the risks of a life in virtual worlds, the question is first and foremost, what motivates people to want to unbound their perception of reality, that they want to submerge in virtual realities, in order to feel more at home there than in physical reality. The neurobiological answer is that through virtual worlds, such as in shooter games, for instance, the reward centers of the brain are effectively activated, so that the body's naturally produced opiates, such as dopamine, are released and cause an intoxication-like state. Irrespective of one's own mental state and the personal imposition of life, but also independent of innate real possibilities, virtual reality therefore offers a great advantage, namely to experience happiness and luck in order to transfer oneself into an intoxication-like state. This can be repeated as often as one seeks out virtual reality for this purpose, with the result that it leads to an ever greater reinforcement of these activated nerve connections, while other synapses are deconstructed. This means nothing other than that a certain use of virtual reality has similar effects as the unhinging of control over reality through drugs or excessive behavior, and doesn't just afford an escape from reality, but also has a high potential of substance dependence. The escape into a virtual parallel world is really problematic, not only when certain states of suffering are avoided or feelings of joy are targetedly sought out, but when one's personality is to be newly invented and constructed through civilization. No, through civilization. One's own thinking, one's own feeling, one's own wanting, one's own judgment comes from a simulated virtual personality, so that this person or those in his or her environment cannot recognize that the personal has the properties of a virtual personality. More than producing a personality, virtualization leads to a deactivation of important ego functionality and abilities, which are the result of psychic structure formation. So I want to speak of some of these effects. A first effect concerns innate psychic strivings, that which strives, which motivates, which enlivens and interests a person barely has a chance anymore against the intoxicating, the inspiring, and stimulating effects of the offerings of produced and virtual experiences. This deactivation of inner impulses is recognizable, for instance, in that one can feel a personal interest only when one is offered something interesting, or tells oneself, oh yes, that is very interesting to me. After all, one learned over the course of personality training how important it is for successful communication to simulate and to show interest, independent of whether something is actually interesting or not. What was first seen in American language use has now become conventional in other languages. One no longer wishes oneself to be inspiring, but to get inspired. The activity is ever less dependent on the own inner strivings, resulting from our psychic structure. A second effect. Whoever really wants to experience himself has to leave the experience of an identity familiar to him behind, and to forego a defined, limited self. If defined contains the Latin word finis, boundary and limit. Moreover, depending on cause, situation, and desire, the self must be replaced by a newly invented self and by a simulated personality. When an unbounded person therefore talks of self-realization, and that could be also interesting for humanist psychologists, because usually for them, self-realization is a very central topic. When a postmodern, ego-oriented person speaks of self-realization, he means something completely different than realization of an unmistakable innate self. For him, it's about the unboundedness of the self through a reinvention, a situationally staged or simulated experience of self. This no longer has anything to do with internalized self-representations. The requirement remains to be himself, however he chooses to reinvent himself. The same is true for the understanding of authenticity. He who cannot do anything but be how he is no longer authentic. He who is able to produce himself such that he perceives it as his own is authentic, though what he sees as his own has nothing to do with his internal self. Tomorrow, he will already perceive something totally different as his own. A third effect. If unboundedness implies the abolition of constraints, then being bound to others is as much at stake as being bound to himself. Unbounded people search among their interpersonal contacts for an unbounded relationship. They want to be free, and they want to be unbounded, and yet be connected by networking and social media. Instead of feeling and practicing individual emotional relational ties, such as tenderness, as trust, yearning, remembering, or missing, and building relationships with their help, with these emotional forces, one cares only about contact, feeling the enacted or simulated feelings offered by the media, or trying to simulate them from a situation of his own. In this way, a relatedness with others lets itself be constructed and realized without feeling a bond or a dependency on such a connectedness. A third effect. A fourth effect. What has already been said about the deactivation of individual emotional bonding force is true in general for the emotionality and experience of feelings in unbounded people. In reality, they characterize themselves through an emotional emptiness. Even feelings are in again, and they are totally into emotions. They reinvent feeling, and this by enacting feelings themselves, or simulating them, or they share in a world of emotions generated and offered them constantly by economy, betting on emotionalization. To share in orchestrated emotions instead of feeling one's own is advantageous for two other reasons. First, one can act out affects that one would never dare to feel. Vengeful, destructive, envious, jealous, murderous feelings. Secondly, one can better repudiate one's own seemingly unbearable feelings by sharing feelings that are not one's own. More effective is a simulation of positive feelings. One wants and feels only the positive for oneself or also for others, so that in oneself, and more so in others, only the neuronal reward centers are addressed and the corresponding neuronal networks are reinforced. All feelings and self-perceptions that are perceived negatively, that is, hurtful and painful, seem to have disappeared. The fact is, nevertheless, one can only really appreciate and love oneself and others when one does not obscure one's own and others' drawbacks, the difficult and the critical, but is capable of accepting and appreciating and perhaps even loving them. Everything else is an idealization and allows positive thinking to become an ideology, as Barbara Ehrenreich convincingly portrayed in her book Smile or Die. Finally, a fifth effect, the internalized bodies of control stand in the way of a reconstruction of personality. What happens to the superego, to the ego ideal and the conscience? As part of one's psychic facilities, they represent a requirement and measure from which the unbounded person has to release himself and herself if he or she wants to live an unbounded life without permanent feelings of anxiety, guilt, and shame. As with all points named so far, here too, one's own capabilities that accompany the mature psychic structure are replaced by something that comes from outside and are supposed to stop an imminent loss of orientation. In the place of an internal regulatory system steps an all-encompassing external orientation. If today a cry is raised everywhere for regulations, for new or old values, for ethics in science or medicine, for occupational or professional ethics, for political and managerial correctness, then this indeed for rule, then this need for role models, for advisors, for therapists, for consultants and coaches has to do with the separation from internalized moral concept and orientation in unbounded people. The external orientation, moreover, requires a permanent review of the consultation or presence of guidelines or guiding concepts. Doubtless, the reconstruction of one's identity enables more self-determination and more subjectively experienced freedom. Doubtless, this is the way. But equally doubtless is that the unbounding of one's identity and from one's aspects of self leads to a withering of such abilities and competencies that have their base in our grown psychic structure. Their extensive deactivation, you can compare it like on a computer where you put a deactivation sign. So in this way, all these inner potentialities are deactivated and replaced by things coming from outside. So their extensive deactivation necessarily leads to a stronger external orientation. The dependence on it surrogates in the form of borrowed passions and affects is also increasing, like that of auxiliary egos and auxiliary super-egos. This, however, are not sought in other people, but in stimulated media and technical marvels, in personality trainings and subjective applied therapy, and in orientating communication offerings. I come now to the end. As beneficial as today's possibilities to surpass limits in science and technology, its use for the reconstruction of personality holds first high risks for mental health of unbounded people. Second, it makes a public recognition and plausibility of the psychoanalytic idea of man and of psychoanalytic methods of therapy more difficult. Because details about the risk to mental health have already been given, just a few more aspects should be mentioned here for why unbounded people have difficulties with psychoanalysis. The first point, unbounded people recoil from everything that could limit them in their self-determination. A psychology that seeks experience and action of people fundamentally determined by their internal representations and impulses, particularly of those that have been constructed in childhood and should still be unconscious for the most part. Such a psychodynamic psychology is difficult for unbounded people to accept and obsolete in their eyes. The pursuit of boundlessness aimed at their own personality wants to reinvent the self by replacing all structural requirements with self-determined beliefs and impulses, and comes to bearing with the help of enactments, of simulations and suggestive techniques. That's why they are neither interested in a change of internal structures, nor working on structurally determined anxieties or conflicts or fantasies, and react with resistance when they are brought close to their boundaries. Second point, the psychoanalytic concept of a coherent self, or of a definable experience of identity, but also the conception of an unconscious or repressed reality, is not comprehensible for unbounded people, because those concepts are relics of theoretical paternalism that are not covered by their experience of the self. A third point, therapeutic work with regression does not evoke resistance on principle, because every regression is also a form of delimitation. The same is true for hypnotherapeutic processes. In some conditions, therapy is perceived as a pleasant virtual reality. However, if regression leads to a transference relationships and to emotional dependencies, then escape from the therapeutic relationship remains the only recourse. The fourth point, because the process of psychoanalytic therapy is first and foremost interested in emotional perception of relationship, transference and countertransference, unbounded people lean more strongly to transferential resistance. It's very typical for them to have strong resistances against any transference processes. And the last point, in therapeutic regard, unbounded people also prefer technical solutions with which they can distract from certain effects, from depressive moods, and from states of fear or pain. Moreover, they are interested in techniques of suggestion, of imagination, of staging or simulation in order to psychically realign. Now, this points already suggested that the social acceptance of psychoanalysis will dwindle more in unbounded people. This does not mean, however, that psychoanalysis does not have a future. Just the opposite. But in view of the psychic deficits and dependencies that accompany the reconstruction of personality, it is more important than ever and finds itself from a social perspective in a similar misunderstood position, psychoanalysis today, as at the beginning of its history, when sexuality was a point which was not acceptable for society. So maybe psychoanalysis will have to go through a great crisis, because it has no plausibility anymore for a majority of people. Nevertheless, good psychoanalysts, as we are convinced that we nevertheless on the right way. Thank you very much.
Some moment I was feeling a little bit hopeless about the future of psychoanalysis, but at the same time, I can take the advantage of sharing this fact to say my fantasies, which came to me, that, and maybe also from my experience of working with. I think one of the consequent direct of this unboundedness is computer dependency. More than half of my patients are teenagers and young adults. And I think it's also one of the consequences of processes which you was mentioning about. And I think that psychoanalytic therapy has the possibility to develop those bonds which are opposing the unboundedness. And on some ideals, so it's also creation of some virtual reality, if we are now more and more realizing that the reconstruction of the past, this historical reconstruction is no longer possible, then what we are doing in others, we are developing narratives, and we are developing also a kind of new virtual reality.
In one way, yeah.
In one way, so maybe this experience is a way of opposing that another virtual reality.
Now, I can imagine that the situation is nevertheless quite different. Psychoanalysis was forbidden, as you mentioned in your presentation, for over 50 years, and it's only now for 20 years or 22 years that one can offer psychoanalysis professionally and so on. So maybe psychoanalysis, as in the case of your patient, he found in the internet, psychoanalysis the most interesting. They have occult things to offer and so on. So it has an attractiveness by its peculiarity. That may be a very different situation as, for instance, in Germany, where we have since 40 years psychoanalysis as a paid and acknowledged therapeutic method, which is paid by the insurance companies, but where we are confronted with the situation that this will not go on, in my conviction, not more than 5 or 7 years. And then psychoanalysis will drop out of the normal insurance companies' payments. So, and we have, for instance, a situation that psychoanalysis has dropped out of all university positions in the meantime, replaced by psychosomatics, as we learned it, very similar as we, in its own conceptualizations as we learned with the Rika presentations. This understanding of psychosomatics, replacing the psychoanalytic point of view. So the situation may be in Lithuania, psychoanalysis first will have coming up, maybe, and the situation will be different. But I want to stress another point, what I could imagine. If now, I would assume that also younger people suffer from losing all this so far valued bindings. These were dependencies, but it were also binding, gave security and so on, as you mentioned in your presentation, that they substitute these old bindings by the medias of connectedness. And it would be an interesting research doing about the meaning of electronic media to be connected, which how much this electronic media to be connected, which role this media play here and there. And I could imagine it plays a bigger role here than in our country where we come from. I could imagine. Right. Because by this media you can replace the feeling of being connected to others, and in this way replace the lost bindings. And so what I want to say is that the ability to be alone, to be without the real other, to stay alone and to have your own ideas of your own and so on. It's not so much developed, these ways of individualization is not so much developed as since we have a long tradition there where we could develop it.
Some 100 meters from here, I saw 2 hours ago a very big advertising, free internet for all, with this runner from this square here. It's a movement here, free internet for all, isn't it?
Free
Free internet for all.
That this is a movement, free internet for all, without any fees you have to pay.
But also in Germany, it's now going on.
But that was just advertising. That was just advertising. It's not like some social movement for providing free internet for everyone.
It's not.
No. It's more, yeah, financial thing, commercial thing.
In Germany we have a party which has this goal.
To provide free internet for everyone.
Although I very widely agree with your description of the development by new media and things like this, I would like to ask present fears, as far as your professional situation is concerned, present fears are less than normal imaginings. Perhaps it is necessary not to continue describing diseases in a matter which one is used to, but to invent a new medicine. And perhaps the ideological content of psychoanalysis is not as low as their fans discuss, you know. Perhaps it is higher. I think, for example, in the history of philosophy or in the history of thinking, we had lots of concepts which fail one after the other. And perhaps some of the concepts in psychoanalysis are similar. They don't exist forever, they are not eternal, they change, and perhaps it is important not only to warn from new situations, but also to examine the instruments which one has in hand.
Of course, I would agree in general what you said, but if you look to the developments inside of psychoanalysis, one can say that there is really a change of paradigm. Which means that the individual is not seen in the first line as being driven by drives as Freud did it, but is seen as a relational being, as a being who needs the other to live his life and her life. So the mainstream of psychoanalysis changed in this respect. It is discussed under the term intersubjective paradigm, and means that psychoanalysis is not anymore in the first line a question of satisfying your drives, but being related to others and how this happens. And that is, I don't think that this is very old-fashioned. The question arises here, is this being related to others molded by your own emotional capacities, or it is directed by outer offerings or feelings and sentimentalizations and so on? That is the main question, and therefore, and also in this respect, I would say the plausibility of this new psychoanalytic point of view will be diminished more and more, because the logic is we are alive if we are enlived, not if we live out of our own abilities.
I think somehow this was the point also with the humanistic psychology. Just thinking of human beings as not pathologic beings, but as they are. And I think this is an interesting aspect of connecting again with the humanistic part.
And maybe we can have some words about from humanistic colleagues. No, just maybe how your opinion, not question, but maybe your remarks about this.
Remarks.
I'm not capable of, I'm not the authority. So you would need to address Rimas Budrys.
Tai išversk, kaip
Aš nežinau.
We made the arrangement that I had the first word this evening and he will have the last word this evening. So I think we had the point.
Still have to keep some limits. So yeah, really, I would like to thank everyone for coming, for participating. Some months ago, when we started exchanging emails with Rainer, I understood that a group of people are going into a long journey to travel, to know better this region of Europe. And I hope that this way which you have traveled would be used for traveling many more times. So we have some traditional switch which are called amber way. Amber way. I think it can be this way which will connect us in the future, and I hope that we will be using this way for future communication and exchanges. So I give Rainer to shape